Welcome to Beyond the Surface. We highlight unique voices in architecture and design. We share their stories to uncover who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing our Beyond the Surface team. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that we ran into technical issues with the recording audio, but we have done our best to get it improved. We hope you enjoy this episode. Today's episode is called Proof of Concept with our guest, Rafael Robles. Rafael is the co-founder and director of Duo, an innovation studio lab that works to create built environment innovations for the benefit of society. Duo partners with organizations of all types through design, strategy, and innovation services, and by launching ethical real estate development and related ventures. Their project Starling was recognized by the Chicago Neighborhood Development Awards as second place for the 2025 Driehaus Foundation Award for Architectural Excellence in Community Design. Rafael is a strong advocate for human rights and was one of the first recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I've heard you speak a little bit through mass context, so I know that you're a developer and you do a lot with architecture and human rights. So it's great to have you here. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
So we'll start a little bit with your background. So can you tell me a little bit how you grew up?
Yeah. So it's a loner story, but I was born in Mexico and I grew up in Mexico in San Luis Potosí. San Luis Potosí is a city about 4 hours north of Mexico City. And it's a state that is really interesting just culturally because half of the state is a desert. But then my mother is from a place in Mexico called Acapulco, which a lot of people know. It's a beach town. We spent about half our time there. So I always say I have like beach guy miles in me, and it's from that. So I lived in Mexico until I was about 13 years old. And when I was 13, my family moved to Chicago for about a summer. And we lived in Chicago for a summer. When we moved, we were undocumented. And we ended up through the jobs that my parents had moving to Palatine, Illinois, which is a suburb northwest of Chicago, just about like 45 minutes northwest. I went to high school in Palatine, and as I was graduating high school as an undocumented person, there was a big question of like, what are you gonna do next? And in Palatine, there's a community college called Harper College. So I attended Harper College for 2 years, and I did that before attending UIC, the University of Illinois at Chicago, for the architecture program. But the background gets a little interesting because while I was at Harper College, my brother and I were visiting a friend at Harvard. We were visiting for spring break. We took an Amtrak train because we didn't have driver's licenses. And when the train stopped in Buffalo, New York, Buffalo Porters Canada immigration officers boarded the train, but they asked everybody for their documentation, and we didn't have it. So then we were detained, and we were sent to a place called Wayne County Jail. Usually, people who are detained for immigration issues are sent to immigration detention centers, but they told us that it was full, so they sent us to the nearest county jail, which was insane. So I was 19 years old at the time. It was 2010. My brother was 20. We were actually detained on my birthday, which was absurd, kind of a life occurrence. And then we were detained on a Friday. So immigration is horrible in terms of like laws and procedures. So immigration, you can't pay a bond, which is kind of the equivalent of a bail, it's 200 weeks, but you can't pay for that on the weekend. If you're detained on a Friday, then you have to stay detained. We were fortunate that while we were in high school, we were sort of like really involved in school and played a lot of tennis and played a lot of sports and did clubs and things like that. So we were very close with our tennis coaches, and they helped to organize like right after our retention and help my family to pay for a bond, $5,000 each from me and my brother. And so if we didn't pay for that bond, then you just had to stay in jail until the court date. But the immigration situation was that you weren't going to get a court hearing until the next 3 months. But when we were decaying, you didn't know when it was going to be. So fortunately, they organized, paid the bond. The difference between a bond and a bail is that if I would get back on the situation sort of fully resolved, that's in a nutshell. And then a bail is just the fee, basically. So, we joke with our tennis coach that helped us pay the bond that he owed some of the interest that to go and payday for as a team. It's a dark joke, but it's okay. So then we come out of jail, and our lawyers basically told us that we fit the model profile for a thing at the time that's called the Dream Act, that's trying to get passed. And the Dream Act would provide children who were sort of like removed here with their families, who are undocumented, a path towards citizenship eventually. The Dream Act was put up for a vote and it did not pass. It was heartbreaking for everybody. And deferred action for childhood arrivals is something that kind of happened after that. But through that process of the Dream Act, my brother and I and our sister, very shortly after, started doing a lot of immigration advocacy work that took the form of, meetings with politicians, like local representatives, state representatives. It took the form of meetings with organizations that promoted and protected immigration rights, human rights, like the National Immigrant Justice Center. We work a lot with the Office of Senator Durbin on immigration issues and kind of being spokespeople. And it was an interesting transition because we went from nobody knowing that we were undocumented, it's not even our best friends knew, to everybody knowing that we were undocumented. Stories at the LA Times and quoted in the New York Times and like all these different media sources. So it was something that happened literally overnight. And it's something that led to us eventually being able to obtain DACA. My brother and I received deferred action a year before and DACA was announced. Then we were kind of like rolled into that program. But DACA essentially gave us in a nutshell, a social security number and ability to work, but it came with the caveat that you can leave the country, but you can't re-enter the country, right? So you can't go back, or really can't leave the country. But because we were able to obtain a social security number, our life just kind of opened up. And so after we were detained, we were at Harper College for 2 years. We were wondering, so we're like, where are we going to go for college? This happens. We get a social security number and a work authorization. And my brother went to Loyola University for school, and I went to UIC. And throughout this immigration path, the question was are we going to pursue the thing that continues on sort of the advocacy path, legal degree or, something like that. My brother ended up pursuing education and then later public policy degree. He has a master's of public policy from University of Michigan. But I liked architecture and design. So I went to UIC to study architecture.
I think that the entire process was so absurd. That's I don't want to rant too much about it because especially in the time that we're going in right now, there's a lot of immigration. There's a lot going on, especially in Chicago. I guess this is just a really nervous topic for me to talk about, just because I actually never have really talked with someone as much who has had more experience with actual immigration. I will say I am pretty lucky that, especially even in the community I grew up in, there were stories here and there, but I never actually really interacted with them. I never interacted with people who had really went through it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's difficult to sometimes bring to the forefront of who you are, because in a way, it's something that is quite literally made up, right? Like laws are made by people, and not part of nature. Humans are placed in these different categories for no reason at all, and then we're judged based on that category for no reason at all. And so I think, even growing up, especially when you're around people that get you, it's not something that you're constantly having to explain or talk about. I think there are environments where it's more confrontational, where you might have to constantly be kind of validating yourself. So I think that part of the experience is difficult for everybody who has any kind of immigration situation, right? For undocumented people, it's brutally difficult to live a normal life because you don't. For example, when I was a kid, you couldn't have a driver's license. Now you can have a driver's license. Chicago is a more progressive city, but you're still living with this underlying fear about what might happen to you or what might happen to your family. And then there's this really difficult feeling of having to behave. I think that's a really awful thing to feel, because it's not like you're doing that thing at all, but you feel like you can't get a speeding ticket. You can't get pulled over for blowing a red light by accident, or if an actual accident happens, you don't know what will escalate into something much, much larger that then feeds into your immigration situation and either discards you from being able to fix the immigration situation in the future and get a green card and things like that. Or, I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't know anything. So when we were detained, one of our first questions was are we going to get put on a plane and sent back to Mexico? So that's not how it happens. But as a kid, as a young person, you don't know. So you're kind of living with that fear. And then what happening right now is just terror, actual constant pressure. I mean, a lot of people I talk to personally are afraid to like go to work, go get groceries. They think about should we go to a different grocery store? Do we know if they're targeting neighborhoods? Like nobody knows anything. But I think Chicago is doing really good organizing around immigrants' rights, and a lot of that, the local representatives. I think the mayor and governor are probably doing a good job of pushing back against the federal government. So I think it takes everybody working together. And when the whole kind of like the tension happened for me, people used to like, "Oh, you're so brave, not sharing your story," and things like that. And at the time, I didn't really feel me like that. But I think part of what's brave about all of the people that share their story is that there is that kind of like factor of the unknown of like, if I share my story, is that going to affect like my future employment because my future boss might be racist or against immigration and have some bias, or because I've met a lot of people with a lot of biases. So sometimes it's not even like the evil villain sitting in the desk waiting for you to show up not to give you a job, but it's people who have like underlying biases against certain people, or just like they've been watching the wrong TV shows or grew up in a very isolated community, so they just like, it's the combination of ignorance, the combination of like flat out racism, a combination of just like not knowing how to like people's lives.
And when you talked about your experience with the entire immigration process, I noticed you also were really talking about what your siblings passed. I think that's important because you do work with them right now. So your story does include their story because it all happened to your entire family. Like even though it was just you and your brother, everybody was affected. And like you said earlier, there is that fear that it's not just you being affected, it's your entire family. You have to behave because something could happen to your family as well. There's repercussions for not just you, but for other people. So when entering college, you ended up studying architecture. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it is an interesting choice because I mean, I've thought about it a lot, sort of why I chose architecture. And I can't remember why, but I do know that this is very much like analyzing the past. But I think like I have experienced a lot of different environments. The city in Mexico where I lived, and then going a lot to Acapulco. It's like a different city in Mexico. We used to drive, so I used to see Mexico City. Mexico City is like massive place. And then when we moved to Chicago, we experienced the Chicago environment, like three flat, and then moved to the suburbs, and it was like single family house environment. And so I think like environments have always been a really important part of my personal experience as a person. But I think now doing the type of work that I do, I realized that the social circumstance that I had was also so deeply reflected in like the physical space, the built environment. And then I also kind of like started realizing that all these things are made by people, right? Like that are no different from me. It's all made up stuff. It's like a series of decisions from people that are put in those positions to decide. So then I think that some of the influences that drove me to architecture, I landed at UIC, which is a very architecture theory heavy place. And I've always been kind of like a tinker. Like I liked playing video games. I like making things and building stuff. So that's how I ended up at UIC. But it's worth mentioning, I didn't know anything about architecture school. So I didn't know how to pick UIC versus IIT versus going somewhere else. So it was kind of like a function of picking the one that was like more available, that seemed cheaper. In the end, I was wrong. Like UIC, the public school, my brother ended up paying less for tuition at Loyola because he got scholarships. Because it's not like a state funded university like UIC. So all of those things that feed into that immigrant experience. Like I didn't have people taking me to schools and touring campuses and things like that. Little by little, I think like I had a lot of privileges at home with my family, having like that tight nucleus. So we all sort of like lean on the things that we have access to and work on the ones we don't.
I feel like I can also relate to that a little bit. I am also first generation college student. I had a lot of mentors really supporting me and giving some guidance. And I was able to tour a few schools that I didn't end up going to. It was weird because it was like during COVID, so I had never really been to IIT before coming. But I think what was interesting that you're saying is everything is built by design. It was just somebody who decided that that's how it was going to be, and it was. And I think that that's like the perfect description to almost any job that exists. Even when you were talking like about policy, you talked about how people just decided it was to be that way. And architecture is something that does affect other people's life. And I'm pretty sure you somewhere along the way ended up finding that.
Yeah, and it's a heavy question. It's like if you point out an empty Latin, somebody asks you like, what should that be? What is the best case scenario? That is a huge question. And so that's what drove me to start Duo, and the connection to policy, especially with my brother, made a lot of sense. Like while I was in kind of like the architecture world, my brother was studying public policy. And so we would talk to each other, and he would say like, well, Alex, architecture writing that you're reading and like all the things that they say in these interviews is like so like surface level information, but these architects are like theorizing the hell out of it and like talking about all these things like they're objective natural truths. And so like in his world and policy, like they were looking at different things from different angles and writing like there's like intangible things that affect the way that we live. And so I would look at this world and I'd be like, well, they're just talking about stuff and writing pictures. They're not like doing these things, like implementing, the services that are good for everyone. Like they're just writing papers about like what it would be or what it would look like or who would fund it or who would organize it. And so I think it was kind of like both worlds had this sense of inaction, like people are dreaming up a lot of cool stuff, but like why doesn't it happen? And going to UIC was really impactful for that because my professors were really talented, are really talented, and they had these really cool like unbuilt projects that I was always like, this is crazy, right? Like why doesn't anybody build this stuff? Like why don't they build this stuff? But the answer that I kept coming across was that this notion of like you need a client that will do it, and so like you need to convince somebody that will do this. And if it's so out there, then you need to basically find somebody that will just fund your work because of the artistry of it and not because of the architecture and function of it. And so that was one aspect that I think we ended up driving us to work in the way that we work. We say we do norm and form making. So it's like if architects design forms, we often say like who designs the function, right? Like the form follows function thing. And so the norms are things that we can design too, right? Like when I'm an immigrant, I say you could build a wall on the border and people can't come through, or you can have a policy that says that people can't come through, and all this made up stuff like people have to have passports. Like that's all made up. It's just somebody that came up with some rules and then they gave form to those rules in some way. So we think that it's all designable, and because it's all designable, we have the ability to change it for the better. So our focus to kind of like quote unquote innovate or like come up with new things is so that we can bring things to the world that are like for societal benefits.
And I like that you found that connection because, like you said, it is possible to change them. Like my sister, she's studying law right now, and it's more about like learning what's already there,
Mm-hmm.
what's already set in stone. But architecture, it's all about change. It's about theory, how you can make things better. And I feel like you were saying like UIC was a really good fit for you because you're able to explore what could be and apply it to policy, which is very unique because not many people think that way. But could you talk about how the partnership with your siblings first began with Duo?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll back up a little bit, and it's worth mentioning kind of like an early trajectory because it's not traditional to architecture. And something that the term that we use to describe our work is multicontextual, partly because maybe now after knowing the immigrant experience makes also even more sense. It's like we really believe in creating these like new things. When you look at something and you're like, what do you call that? Kind of know what it does. That would be like gold standard for like we did our job, right? Like for our building, it's like you walk in and you're like, this feels really good. And it's kind of this and it's kind of that. It's kind of like when you hear a new type of music that you really like, and you're like, yeah, this sounds like a little bit of influence of this and a little influence of that. It's new. You used to hear this a lot. It's like, are you from Mexico or are you from here? And at some point, advocates started saying, I am from Mexico and I am from here. I am from both. And I'm just like this combination of the strengths of both. And it makes me who I am. It's interesting. I don't have to pick one and defend why I'm one or the other. I'm both. So this multi-contextual thing is important. So this kind of like feeds into my career trajectory. I was at UIC. When I started at UIC, I had just received my work authorization, so I was eager to intern. I've always liked working more than I did school, even though I really liked school, and I ended up doing both when I was up in there. Too much stuff. But I started interning at this architecture firm called Studio 222 Architects. They're still around. They were like really, really nice people. I mean, I didn't know anything. I was on first year architecture student. After being in college for 2 years, you had to do 4 years at UIC. So it's also worth mentioning because I'm not trying to say I was doing full-time college and working because I had done college, I was going to UIC basically part-time. So then I could intern more. There was partly how I was able to afford college, just working in the thing. My parents supported. And so then scholarships and all this stuff. But Studio 222 was doing work that I wasn't as interested in. It was more smaller fire stations, or my first project event was doing window details for an LA Fitness in the suburbs. And so it wasn't something it wasn't kind of like the promised land that I was seeing at school. And when I talked to colleagues, not just at that firm, but sort of people in that practice, I kept hearing this oh, it's school is just where you go dream, and then real life is where dreams come to die, and you see what clients want you to do, and hopefully you find cool clients or very wealthy clients that will pay for those fancy buildings. So that was kind of probably the runway. So then through immigration advocacy, I came upon Studio Gang. So my stories are oftentimes connected to most events. This is a very brief one. My brother and I, through this immigration advocacy thing, we were doing the speech to give somebody an award. It wasn't our award, we were just kind of introducing them. And so we had to be up on the panel at this National Immigrant Justice Center yearly event, this luncheon. And my sister looks over, and it's a room full of sponsors that are usually law firms. And my sister's like, "Hey, isn't that architecture firm that you talk about?" And it was Studio Gang. And so I was like, yeah, that's super random that they're here. They were there because their client was receiving an award. It wasn't the award that I was giving, but he received an award. And so on the spot, I modified my speech to because I didn't have that I was studying architecture or whatever. So my brother was like, "You should riff off that you're an architecture student. You never know." So I did. So then I was I was studying architecture at UIC. So then after speech, the Studio Gang table, naturally, there's no other architects in the room. So they came up and they were like, "Hey, we heard you're an architecture student. We're an architecture firm. And if you want a tour of the office, then you'll be happy to give you a tour." So I was like, of course, took them up on it, went on a tour, asked for a job. They didn't have a job. Recently, I saw somebody, I went back to see how many times I followed up. It was 8 or 9 times that I was like, "Hey, I still run." And then out of nowhere, they called me and they're like, "Want to come in? We can give you a job." Mark Schendel was a really big mentor. At the time, Studio Gang was still small. I was maybe number 38 or something, not kind of the international firm that it is today. But I was really, really fortunate, series of fortunate events. And then I really applied myself at Studio Gang and at school, because Studio Gang was a place where they were taking interesting topics and theory and then designing for them and collaborating with people that were outside the field. And so I was deeply influenced. And I was doing that at the same time in school. And then when I graduated from UIC, I kept working at Studio Gang for a couple of years. But more and more, I was interested in the clients. All the questions that I kept asking landed at the clients. So it was why do you want that tower to be 10 stories and not 8 stories? Because the client said that finances they're modeling are that, it's okay. How do you know it shouldn't be like a grocery store or a park? Because clients have modeled that out. A place like Studio Gang is a little different because now there's more collaboration with the clients, but still, the client who has a tower, it's a tower. So it's cool because, a place like Studio Gang really selects projects that align with their values and their mission and vision, but you're still kind of working with the client. So then I didn't know anyone in real estate development, but I saw it as the step before architecture. It's who invents what this place should be. You're telling me this should be a hospital? Who invents how a hospital works? Okay, some company, right? Or you tell me this should be a series of apartments. Who actually designs how people are living in those apartments, right? So I didn't know any developers, so I got a real estate license. I walked into a Berkshire Hathaway and I was like, "Can I have a job?" And they're like, "Yes." That was fancy because it's a big company, but then it runs, you're an independent contractor, so you have to find your own clients, you have to pay for your own insurance. I was like, okay, I made a mistake. And went in on the business books, and they all can teach you a little something, and 75% of the book is just garbage and 25% is useful. And so long story short, I ended up selling real estate, and then I was selling new construction because of my architecture background. And one of the developers that I was working for, that was the developer that was selling these new construction houses, he's also a great mentor. He basically eventually was like, okay, happy to meet with you and like tell you about development, and started kind of like informally teaching you. I used to go to his house and just, have tea with him or coffee, and it was after hours or him. So he was like a really big influence. But then eventually I was able to get a job at his office. They were doing medium-sized projects. They weren't doing commerce, but they were doing kind of like 48 single-family homes or like condo buildings that were like 15 to 30 units. So it's not small projects. And basically what they said to me was like, we can't pay you a lot, but we can teach you everything that we know. And I had this like day where I had to tell studio gang whether I was going to work there full time or answer the developer, but I was working there full time. So if there's a multiverse, so sure. The other verse is still an architect. Started working in development. I worked there for about 2.5 years, and then I learned how to do development. I started kind of like doing grunt work, asking a lot of questions to doing more project management type stuff. But eventually, my path kind of like shifted again.
I feel like your transition from architecture to development was very interesting because it was the connections that you started to create with architecture development. We've spoken to other developers and they sometimes talk about it a little bit differently. But I think the way you started to realize, how do I create the projects I want to create? Or how do I guide the client to create projects that align with my values? And you started to question architecture and question what you want to do with it, and you found it. But a lot of people, when entering the architecture industry, they settle a lot for what they have. They settle and not really trying to go forward. I think what made it interesting is, I do think part of it is the experiences that you did have. It made you push forward. Like after everything that you had went through as a student, as a kid, understanding theory, understanding policy, having conversations with your siblings, all influence these ideas. And you're like, why am I doing this work? And how do I get from here to actually being one of the people who make decisions? And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about everything is design, everything's decided by someone else. How do you become one of the people who make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of hits the nail on the head in terms of, I mean, looking back, my interest in architecture, I think, was that feeling of like, I want to invent a building. It's like, I want to make a place that is this and that it looks like this and that invites people that to do certain things. And unfortunately, I don't think that is an architecture. Traditional architecture education is not that. Traditional architecture education is more like, what is a building, but you're confined to this building, right? But if you're like, what about everything else? Then it's kind of like, oh, sorry, if you want to talk about the building, then we can talk about architecture. Okay, have really interesting conversations and how we like configure the building and the entrances and like, make public space and private space and all these things. Sorry, like they matter, but I was just like at a very basic level. I was like, if you want to come up with a building type, like who does that? Like that was my interest early on. And I will say just like my immigrant experience too is like, because we immigrated from Mexico, like you always have to figure everything out. And my parents were business owners. And when I was in college, I was basically studying architecture with all what comes with it, right? All the theory and the models and stuff like that. I was interning at Studio Gang, and then on the weekends I was going to suburbs to like work on my parents' business. Like they had a used car dealership and a mechanic shop. It's like completely different worlds. Going from the student world to the super high architecture world to like small business where nobody knows Studio Gang or cares, or nobody knows. Like people will talk about space and spatial things in very different ways. All of us humans can tell when you're comfortable or uncomfortable, or like what something like aesthetics, what we like and what we don't like. But in architecture circles, we like intellectualize buildings so much, right? I'm not saying that's a negative thing, but it just happens. So yeah, I think that's essentially what drove me to like keep asking kind of like who invents the stuff. And again, like when you get a brief as an architect, that's normal. That's like not controversial, right? Like architects get briefs from a client. And so then I was always like, well, who came up with this brief, right? Like I want to do that. A lot of architects take pride in saying like, we got this brief. And then what we really focus on is asking the right questions, and then we refine the brief. And it's like, that is a huge service. Like I had this good from the start. It's like, who came up with this brief? Like, how can we help them to make the brief better in the first place? And then do that. So that's what drove me to follow my nose to development. And then I realized development wasn't necessarily that. Like it has a potential to be that. Developers focus on economics, like finances, almost exclusively there. Yes, they're dealing with all these other things, regulations, design issues, finances, fundraising, all these things. But mostly it felt like if the finances worked out for a developer, they were going to do the thing that it worked. So if building a 10-story tower made more money than building an 8-story tower, they're going to go 10-story tower, even if it was better to build an 8-story one, or like even if it was better to build a Hark there. So like all these things, development decisions are driven by finances, and then like the banks are at fault or investors are at fault. But as a developer, part of what's nice is you have agency to choose whose money you take and all these things. It's not easy. It's definitely a hard practice, but all professions are hard in their own regard. And I actually think that developers should be held accountable for a higher standard, or right now there's no standard of ethics, but a higher standard of ethics, because we are living in the buildings that they help to create. So ideally, similar to how we have standards for doctors in medicine, we should have standards for developers too.
In our research before starting Duo, I noticed that you also used to work at Deloitte. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience there as well?
Yeah, Deloitte was a huge step in my career. So I was working in arrested development, and then my story is intertwined with my family. My brother studied public policy, and after his master's, he started working at Deloitte Consulting. Deloitte Consulting is one of the big four, in quotes, kind of consulting firms, right? So they're like some of the biggest consulting firms in the country, in the world, and they do virtually everything. But Deloitte started as an accounting firm, so a lot of people think it's an accounting firm, but now it's like consulting is what they're mostly recognized for. And consulting, similar to development, kind of in quotes, is a job that nobody knows what it is. You're like, how it works, or how do people get paid, or for what, or what do they deliver. But anyways, my brother, when he first got a job in Deloitte, he was in the tax practice and doing transfer pricing. So transfer pricing is like when a company in the US sells their products to a company in Mexico. They sort of like buy from each other, but they're the same company. Like Rafa's Shoes USA sells to Rafa's Shoes Mexico, and then it's like now have an expense, and so is tax game, right? Global transactions. All the big companies do it. And so because of that, like my brother was seeing all these organizational charts, like these org charts for companies and how they're structured in the US and around the world. And there was one client, as he tells the story, that the organizational chart was so large that he needed a plotter. So in the Deloitte office, there was no plotter except for on one floor. So he went to this floor, the elevator doors open, and then sees this name, Dabla, D-O-B-L-I. Dablin is like this innovation studio. Dablin invented design thinking, human-centered design. They actually came out of IIT, and it's a firm that has been so influential in the way that we live that most people don't even know about. But again, Jay Dablin was an industrial designer that was a professor at IIT. Legend tells that his office was across from Mies van der Rohe's office, and they were both influenced by the Bauhaus and the modernist movement. Mies was building buildings, and Jay Dablin was building products, but his interest was more like, how do I know that this laundry machine is good? And so then like he started observing how people use laundry machines and then designing the products based on how people use these things. And it's human-centered design. How humans use things, designed for that. And so my brother basically was like, there's this innovation studio on Deloitte. I don't know anything about it. He talked to some people in there. So he's like, I think they do more design stuff. So you should just like apply. Since he was in Deloitte, he kind of coached me about how to apply and things like that. And I wanted to transition out of development at the time because I wanted to go back into design. Because in the developer's office, I wasn't actually designing. I was more like project managing and overseeing a process. But then like the power to choose was huge, but they didn't choose. So then I was like, this is boring in so many ways. And it was interesting in a lot of ways, and I like the people I worked with, but I just kind of wanted to go back and design. So then I applied to Lebanon and I landed that job. And it was just like a huge, I don't even know how to describe the feeling, but it's like when you see something that has been around for a long time, that you're like, how could I possibly not know about this stuff? That's how it felt. Because in them, there were all kinds of designers. So typically in innovation studios, at least the way that, again, like this all came out of IT, we are in an IT right now, so it's worth mentioning, like basically the contribution that Dublin made to the design field was this pod of designer, a researcher, and somebody with a business background. Like you're going to design something, but it's going to be backed by research of like somebody that's actually studying this stuff. And then it's going to make sense from a business perspective. So that was kind of like the Dublin way. And the designers in the firm were from different design fields. So there were some graphic designers, there were some architects, but very few. There were product designers, industrial designers, so they were just designers. And then there were researchers who had backgrounds in sociology, anthropology, education, of those things. And then there were MBA people that went to business school. And it was cool because I wasn't surrounded by other architects. And so, in my conversations, like I often, the observation I'm making, like a lot of architecture firms, is they want to be multidisciplinary, and that's how they describe themselves. But usually what happens is there are architects, and then there's some people that have a secondary background, or like there might be one or two people in the office that have a different background in the office. They're not truly multidisciplinary because they all kind of speak the same language. And what was beneficial about a place like Deloitte is that I had people asking me, what is design? Literally, without trying to be petty, just like, I thought design was fashion design. When you say design, what do you mean? So then I would have to explain, okay, well, we mean like really thinking about the problems that we're solving, or like the things that we want to affect, or like thinking about the system. So people would be like, oh, I guess I like do that, but I didn't think about it as design. So it's like all these business people that have never even thought about like their decision making as a design process. So it was really cool to see, like, we're gonna use the same design process that we would use to design a building, but to design anything. I don't know how much company names I can mention, but like a giant yoga clothing company's membership, I designed that. A giant pizza company's ordering experience and app, I designed that. So you can create so many different types of things with the same processes that you learned. I give a lot of credit to UIC and Styria because they were so process oriented, and Dublin was also process oriented. Again, similar lines of thinking. And it gave me a lot of grounding in completely different context, because now my coworkers were very multidisciplinary, didn't feel so foreign because would collaborate a lot with my siblings, right? And they are architects. But then I also had a lot of direct visibility to Fortune 500 companies. So it's like, who are the people that actually make these decisions? When you walk into a new type of store, let's say the Amazon Go store, where like you no longer have a checkout, all these goofy things that companies do. It's like, who comes up with this stuff? I saw it. I met them, not Amazon, but just an example. But like, I met these people that were like tasked with coming up with these ideas to be able to sell their products more. It's like as simple as that. And so over time, the reason why I was in Deloitte is Dublin was acquired by a different consulting firm, and then that consulting firm was acquired by Deloitte. Now Dublin was in Deloitte Consulting, and then Deloitte Consulting. It's recently, I think in the last 2 years, removed the Dublin brand. But a lot of the people that have worked at Dublin then have left and work at like leading product teams of different big companies, or doing their own innovation studios or things like that. But it was a world that I really loved because it was very crappy. It was like, you have a team of 4 and you have the designing experience that affects millions of people across the country, just with the 4 of you. And it was like, okay, yeah, we'll do it. Like, nobody was ever like, oh my God, no, we need like rounds of coordination meetings, and like there's coordination and there's planning and there's things, but it was more kind of hands-on, and I really, really enjoyed that environment. So my brother was working at Deloitte. He was out of the tax practice and he was doing strategy consulting. He ended up spending most of his time at Deloitte. He was there longer than I was, but in a place called the Monitor Institute, which is strategy consulting, but for philanthropic clients, so like big foundation, big nonprofits. And so he was able to see that context and realize that people in that context have the same mindsets as people in the business context, and they're, obviously, like any place, like some people have a better mindset towards helping the world or helping others than other people, but you find the same mixed bag in every place. And so we usually say, like, we don't moralize legal entity like a nonprofit or a for-profit or an LLC or whatever, right? It's like, there are good for-profits and there are bad for-profits. There are good nonprofits and there are bad nonprofits. Like, it's not as clear-cut as saying like nonprofit work is good. So that's how I ended up at Deloitte, and I spent most of my time, like my professional time, working there. I worked there for about 4.5 years. And then something that I realized while I was there is that all these cool innovation methods, for one, live in a tiny bubble, literally in an ivory tower, right? Like, this tiny bubble of innovation people, and they don't get out to the world. So it's like, I'm solving these interesting challenges for these giant companies. Why don't I apply the same types of tools and thinking to more local issues, or like neighborhoods in Chicago or things like that? That was one thing. It's like the methods aren't getting used for other things to do good. And then the other thing is that the focus was never on built environment work. Companies like never saw buildings as buildings. It was like, oh, I have a channel and it's my store. And it's like, that's my channel to sell my t-shirts. And it's like your store is a physical space that you can design, that you can influence, that people can feel comfortable in, that can invite other people. So they didn't think about it that way. So when I was at Deloitte, I started this small practice called Deloitte Environments, and we were trying to do more of that type of work. But then my brother and I were more interested in it than anyone else that we were at. So then we left Deloitte and started Duo.
Leading up to Duo, you did so much. Like you tried architecture, you tried development, consulting, and human-centered design. Like that's a big list, and I feel like all of it connects to design in a circle that not too many people know either, especially the public. So with my past in UX design, one thing I also loved about it was I think it was the research part. You had to almost create the problem to solve the problem. And to create the problem, you have to observe and figure out what the problem was. And so when you're talking about the innovation studio, trying to like understand all these issues that go into different like code and different product design, it's still all a little bit more digital. It's not the built environment, which is another reason why I studied architecture instead of digital design. When it comes to bringing architecture and human-centered design and merging them, it becomes a large innovation, development, consulting studio, which is now what I feel like Duo is, correct?
We always joke like it's really, really hard to describe what Duo is because it's kind of new and it's not new. Like I think it's we get my own self-defined gold star for Duo in terms of like you see it and you kind of like see the influences and you kind of know what we do and we do something around work and we do development and do all these other things. But it's not just one singular thing. And again, like my contribution to design, then you have human-centered design, and now you have lines of people that say, oh, it should be human-centered design, it should be environment-centered design, it should be community-centered design. For us, the multicontextual design is our contribution, is our idea. None of those things are like right or wrong. It's like, okay, those are things that are tools in the toolbox that we can apply and we can use, and human-centered design has tons of great methods. We use multi-contextual design to, again, describe as like norm and form making, like design the norms, design the forms together, be one to create these new things. But we really focus on context in part because we feel like context is what really drives an experience and a feeling. So the way that we just define context is like multi-contextual, and what is a context? Is these four things in an environment where we're in, subjects are, people, we're in here, the objects in the space, these things, and then influencing factors, like what influences you to behave the way that you do. Is it history? Is it policy? The weather? You're wearing a jacket because it's cold, or all these things. And so like basically our projects have two paths. It's like understanding context and then recreating context. So like, well, I work anywhere. We first start with like understanding context. And that's a combination of research, it's a combination of public engagement, it's a combination of like all these things, right? Primary, secondary research, public engagement, all these things. So then once you understand it, then you can then create a new thing. And oftentimes, again, our contribution, the way that we see it too, and on some of these fields that aren't even just design fields, it's like, could be policy, it could be health, education, like all these things, is like the mental flip from problem solving to reality creating. So it's like normally we're taught that you have to find top 5 pain points or like these problems across a journey map, or like what are the top problems that you're solving. But what we like to think about is if you're creating something new, then like what is the reality that you're creating? And it helps us to be way more expansive with the decisions that we take, and also take ownership of the decisions that we make and be able to be transparent when we communicate those decisions. So we don't say like, oh, well, I'm just doing this because the bank, or because my client said, or because nobody likes me in the community, so I'm just not going to talk to anybody. Like we often say like, tell me the dream, like what's this reality that you want to create? And then tell me where that came from. It should be backed by something. You don't just invent things from out of thin air. Right? So I think that is not part of architectural education. It's like we usually problem solve to the problems that are created by the clients, essentially. Like we get a client brief and then we do a site visit and we kind of like study like context and architecture needs like other buildings around most of the time. More recently, you see more like community engagement things, but then like part of the reason why it was important for me to work in the innovation lab is that community engagement is basically user research called something else, but user research has been established for decades because policymakers have been doing that. But in architecture, it's pretty recent. Maybe 2016 started to get trendy, and now it's starting to get more established as a no-brainer. Like you don't do any public engagement, that's like, okay, it's not very good work, right? But I felt like it was lagging. So when we left Deloitte in Dublin, and we didn't want to create an architecture firm, who are the people that have got new types of feelings? Like, the sample reads is a cafe. How does a cafe work? If I tell you, like, I'm building a cafe, you're going to imagine the Starbucks model of a cafe. Like, there's a bar, you go up, push dolly tables so you can work there, and there's people on the laptops. But they made that. And they made that for a very particular purpose. Like, they made that to sell a lot of coffee very fast. The people that were out to go to work. There's a lot of decisions that were made into creating that particular model, but now it became so cemented, like this norm, right? That then we all sort of like imagine that. But cafes work in different ways in different parts of the world. They used to be in more social places. We like have seen even stories of the London Stock Exchange was a coffee house and they traded stocks at the cafe. Like, that's weird. And then like Isaac Newton dissected a dolphin there, and there's just a crazy story. Yeah. So that's not what comes to mind when you think of the cafe. So part of our work is to really help to find those like cemented ideas and really question them. So what do you mean by house? What do you mean by kitchen? Like, what do you want to do? So in the difficulty of describing Duo, we also don't really subscribe to an identity. And again, like that feeds into the immigrant stuff. So like, I'm not here, or I'm not this or that, I'm not from here or from there. We usually just describe what we do. That yes, we do development, and yes, we do architectural work, and yes, we do construction. Like we do construction ourselves. Yes, we operate the building, and you can do all of the things. And I think it's becoming a lot more common in our generation and their generations to do a lot of different things and like get rid of like, I'm an architect or I am nothing, which I think is great because we are to so many different things. And so that's kind of the spirit of the practice too, is that we can do more than buildings, but built environment related projects is like our focus.
Yeah, I feel like the perfect description of Duo would be we do everything.
That sounds great. I will put that on a t-shirt.
Okay.
But
But I feel like when you were talking about Duo, you were talking about a lot of the type of ideals you guys hold, the type of design you guys also try to do. And I feel like it's paired a lot with research. And I think in this conversation, we've stressed about how important that is. I did like when you talked about the forward context they use to develop and design. And I think one of the projects that you guys have that really stands out to us is Starling. Can you talk about Starling and other initiatives that Duo also does?
yeah, of course. So Starling is a really interesting work. We call it our album drop because it was the first project that we developed like from the start. But it was the first project that really, in our mind, represented the way that we work. The process of creating it is just as important as the outcome. And the process started in 2017-ish. So you guys had got engaged to kind of reimagine 16th Street. 16th Street is a street that has tons of empty lots now today, but it used to be a commercial corridor with like bakeries and like all the things, right? Classic Chicago commercial corridor, very beautiful, and people really loved using it and going there. After Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were a lot of riots and a lot of the buildings were burnt down. And because a lot of the neighbors, a lot of people that lived in North London didn't own the buildings, and those buildings never got reconstructed. Everything that the government has done to like disinvest in their place has probably happened in North London. There's been redlining, contract buying, there's been illegal dumping of materials, like all these things. So it's like a very difficult place to build mentally for people. But when we were going there, we saw that people are just people, right? Like people in North London are like perfectly nice and everybody wants to have a comfortable life. And it's just a place that has not gotten investment or development. So there's no easy access to anything. Like you want grocery store, you have to go to a different neighborhood. And I say that kind of like every neighborhood should have their own grocery store, but also we shouldn't have such hard reliance on ourselves for the different neighborhoods, right? So just because something's in a little village 2 blocks away doesn't mean that's not in your neighborhood, right? So it impacts people in different ways in different regions of a place, of a neighborhood. But anyways, we were engaged just to reimagine the 16th Street. At the time, we were walking up and down 16th Street and going into businesses and talking to people. And that was my brother and I, another colleague, Mario Romero, who was collaborating with us on that project before Duo, because that was 2017. Duo was 2019. So people were acting like we were crazy. They're like, how could you possibly walk up and down 16th Street? Something's going to happen to you. Look at the crime rates and look at the snails. Nothing happened to us. People are very welcoming. 16th Street, like many places in the city, has any kinds of problems that the city would have, gangs or drugs and things like that. So it felt like people were pointing the camera very heavily on 16th Street or on Los Angeles and like telling one particular story, which, okay, those things have a history and tend to happen and things like that, but it wasn't the only thing that was happening in North London. So a lot of the people in North London were self-organizing and wanted to bring the neighborhood back to what they sort of like, a lot of people, what they remember. So at the time, the project wasn't to create the corridor or anything like that. So we, as an architecture firm, I guess like that's where the project stopped. For Studio Gang, they did the work and it was all good. But my brother and I didn't want to just like stop and leave. In fact, we suggested that we didn't make like a rendering of 16th Street because we felt like it was going to get used for the big developers to see or feel like, oh, that's maybe a place that I can buy a bunch of land and then hold it and over time and then we don't. So we didn't make that image, and it was more an invisible kind of intangible job, talking to people, organizing people, and connecting them meetings and stuff like that. That was the surface like that was the job. So it was not architecture, I guess, for the capital. It was not building. So my brother and I created this real estate development class. So we were like, we met so many people that want to develop small scale buildings. And so we're like, we should teach them how to do it. Because when I worked for a developer, once I learned how to develop, my first instinct was to go with my brother and do that. Hey, we should build a building. It's not that hard. You know, it's, you need to find the money and you need to do the content management. And so we put together this class that was free and we gave it in Orlando. And then that class grew a lot into maybe like 7 cohorts now that we could across time. So we had been working in North London for a long time, basically. We knew that there's a lot of creative energy, but not a lot of places to effectuate that. So when you think about like, what do you want to do when it comes to like work or the things that we do, we usually like to think like you can't be a chef without a kitchen. You can't be a tennis player without a tennis court. Like you need some of these physical places, right, to like do the craft that you are interested in doing. So in North Londale, it's a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of those amenity spaces. There's funding from the government coming down from COVID, and a lot of organizations are trying to build like social services into North London. So like clinics, rehab centers, and things like that, which are needed. But what's also needed are places to just exist, like places to hang out, and places to fall in love, and places to just be a person, right? Like to tell those stories. And so we bought the lot that Starling's in, and we didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but we knew that we wanted to do something that responded to those voices, to people in the neighborhood who essentially had been telling us that they wanted to do things for more kind of like leisure, for self-expression. So we did a lot of public engagement and a lot of design work, and we created this concept of a space for liberation. And what does liberation mean? So we have all this research on Colin Freire and Angela Davis and the Zapatista movement in Mexico, right? So how do they describe liberation? What do you need to achieve this liberation? And basically, like at the end of the day, the actions that kind of like were conducive for people to achieve liberation are gathering, replenishing, learning, and creating. So, you know, gathering with people that you love and that you meet or whatever, learning new things and like being curious, replenishing, like resting, like hanging out, and that creates like how can you personally kind of like participate in creating something new. So that was kind of like our concept, right? Under that concept of liberation, like how do you make a place that facilitates those 4 things? That's liberating actions. And so in comes like the money gain, right? Like how do you make a place like that that also like a bank will give you a loan for, or that foundation will give you a grant for? And so we wanted to couple it with like a local amenity, right? And so we usually have a concept in all of our projects, and the concept drives every decision from the branding to the architecture to the business, the experience. So this liberation thing. So we partnered with Monday Coffee, who had been doing kind of pop-ups across the city, Soho House, Garfield Clark, at Piazza Gates, this Currency Exchange Cafe. And they also had like this strong sentiment about decolonizing coffee, because coffee is like not only farmed in places where black people live, but the companies that owned by white. So we created starting sort of like this in mind. Starling will have this amenity of coffee, but it won't be like your kind of model coffee shop where like you can't use any of the spaces. You just go for yourself. You can just go there and use it, and if the coffee shop's open, great, and if not, then it's just closed. And so the rest of the spaces then we abandoned as like places for people to use. And now the way that it works is like people can rent the spaces in the building by the hour and then do whatever they want to do. So if they want to host the yoga class, you can do that. Just pay for an hour, do your yoga class, and do that thing. A lot of the people in there could get a discount on the hourly rates. The hourly rates are like extremely accessible compared to everywhere else in the city. But it also helps to support people who have this kind of like entrepreneurial spirit that we found in Los Angeles, right? Like if you want to do your yoga class and start a yoga business, you don't have to go rent a storefront for 5 years and try to convince a landlord to give you a chance that you're going to pay them back. Right? You can just do your classes on Saturdays, charge people whatever you'll charge, $10, whatever people pay per yoga class. And then if your business is booming, then like, okay, use it as a proof point and open up your own yoga studio, right? And so again, like speaking about context, North Lawndale has a lot of empty lots. And so like, it's very different from other places in the city with no empty lots, like the Village or Pilsen. There's not a lot of empty lots there. I think North Lawndale has like 2,500. I mean, like a lot of empty lots. So we also wanted to like create a place where people could come to as an amenity every day. And every time you go, it's like, oh, there's chess happening today. Oh, there's an art gallery up today. Like, just for day-to-day life. So it's kind of cool because it's a place that didn't exist. Like that's not really quite how coffee shops work, or we haven't found other places in the city that are quite like that, where you can rent the space or use the space. People use it for baby showers, graduation parties, prom pictures. A shoe brand was there doing a running club. So there's these big brands, these local people. So it's become multicontextual, right? Like it's become this confluence of so many things. Artists launching, fashion likes. I mean, it's been really cool, and it doesn't have anything to do with us as Duo per se, those particular events. But we created a space, but the way that people use it has been up to them, and it's magical, honestly, to see how they bring the space to life and how they redecorate or move the furniture or build temporary partitions. Like, I mean, it's been really cool. But the building itself, like what the building is that it's like a local amenity plus, like you can rent, I guess, The other important aspect of Starling was the design, which I can talk about, but the really interesting aspect is this new model that we're calling in the office money on tap, kind of jokingly, but it makes sense. So if you imagine a commercial building as a utility, like a solar panel gathers electricity, you store the electricity, and then you can use it or you can sell. Same with like water, right? You have a barrel, it rains, your barrel gets full, you can use the water or you can give it to someone or whatever, right? Like, let's just say you can drink it or you can water your clients or whatever. So that's like, these are utilities. And so for commercial buildings, the utility of a commercial building is making money. That's why people build commercial buildings. Ultimately, like as much as we want to say like, oh, these developers should build like commercial buildings because they want to bring a bakery to the neighborhood, it doesn't really happen that way. I honestly would say like now up and coming developers, especially Black and brown up and coming developers, are thinking that way, which is really cool. But traditional developers don't think that way. It's like, oh, if I open up a coffee shop in this neighborhood, then I'm gonna make a lot of money. So then like that opens up. Or like I'm just gonna make a Manila box bland building and like hope to get a tenant that pays a lot of rent, and I'm gonna put them in it. I don't care who it is, right? And that's what happens downtown. That's where downtown sucks, because it's like all these commercial businesses that like have no soul. I mean, they're just too big to have like the owner there ranking the stuff. But we love that feeling, right? When you walk into a coffee shop and the owner hands it to you and you're like, oh, you're the owner? Like, that's cool. I live here. Use it. Now I know you ran it. That's the next one. But anyways, there's money on tacting. So we imagine the building as a utility. So then from the rents that people rent by the hour and the rent that Monday Coffee pays, the money barrel gets full. I mean, there's expenses, right? Like we pay the loan and we'll pay the electricity and all those things. But then the money left over, what we're doing is we're going to redistribute it to people that visit the building the most in $500 payments. So it's as simple as that. Like, it's a made up rule. like any other policy. It's a policy that we're implementing like any other policy, right? Like, why $500? Because if you make $600 and you have to report it as income to the IRS, that's a huge pain. Why just the payment? Because we don't think that we should be policing the way that people spend their money. Like, my dream is we're right next to a high school, like a high school student does their homework there every day and they get $500 at the end of the year and buy a PlayStation and that makes them happy. Go ahead. That's awesome. You don't have to consume coffee. You don't have to rent spaces, like just being in the space. We haven't launched it yet. We're going to launch it towards the end of this year. And there's going to be just like this box that you write your name on in a note and you put it in the box and that's it. It's like super low tech, no cranking or anything like that. It's like, here's the building. You want to put a note in the box. At the end of the year, we're going to count them. And then we're going to distribute $500 payments as much as the barrel holds, right? Like if it's a really good year and if there's more money because people rented it like crazy, then more $500 payments. If it's a year where like there's no money in the barrel, then nobody gets a $500 payment, right? So we were playing with this project. We were playing with this notion of like ownership, like who owns the building? Because for one, the way that people use it, we wanted people to take ownership, but use it like it's yours and do whatever you want in it. So that was one design aspect. And then part of it too was like the financial return of it. It's like, we want you to get a return just for being a participant in this context, in this environment, right? And being in the neighborhood and things like that. So that's something that I think is going to be really exciting. So again, like that model does not exist anywhere that we know of. And many of our other projects, we often think of our work, we try to set precedents that then other people can either use outright, like directly, or that they can point at and be like, oh, they did that thing. So what if I do something similar, but a little bit different based on where I am or based on my context, the people that I'm working with? So that's our aspiration. But Starling is, again, like there's so many layers to it that is hard to talk about. And the design is a whole other thing too, like the actual building. The short version is like it was designed to facilitate all these things, but also like made of cast in place concrete because we wanted the building to feel permanent, like it had already been there. There's a lot of trauma in the neighborhood about buildings going down and like never got rebuilt and like all these things, and like a lot of planning that never gets action up. So we really wanted to make a building that happened fast, so the scale is small, so that we didn't build a project for 5 years. It's like we want to do something in 1 year. We built it in 4.5 months with a lot of public participation, and it was something that once built, it's like, oh yeah, I can't imagine that not being there. It's like such a beautiful thing. And then the blue on the building, again, like the concept was liberation, so blue is a color that kind of has represented that spirit in a lot of different cultures, Mexico, the Mayans, or like in a lot of parts of the world, actually. We created this like public art project basically, where we hand painted the blue walls. We stained up basically with a good paint, with a rag. We like wiped all of those walls, and we collaborated with an artist from Mexico, Juan de la Mora, who I worked at Studio Gang with before. So yeah, it's a project that, again, like I think something that we like to set the precedent for is also the way we practice. My brother and sister built the giant pegboard in the library in Starling, and it's something that we like to encourage, especially like up-and-coming practices, to think about how they work and think about like what they're good at and what they want to do, and basically like trying to get away from the traditional architectural practice or design practice or policy work or urban mining work. Like there's so much that you can do. You just kind of have to tinker with where you're at.
I think the entire process starting was very unique. I don't think I ever heard of a process like that before. Especially you guys went into the neighborhood and really communicated with everybody. You guys taught everybody. I think that was pretty impressive. Like really being like, if you guys want investment, we don't want you guys to be displaced. So we're gonna help you guys so that you guys keep your neighborhood, but we can also invest into your community. That's so innovative and also just very powerful. I've never heard of a story like that, at least not from people who are usually doing development. But I also feel like the community center will have a lasting impact. Everything you guys did was designed to help the community, from the design process and the type of programs that it can hold. Everything was designed with intention, by observing the people who were already there, by having conversations and collaborating. And that is very innovative and it's very different. A lot of people in architecture do still communicate with their clients, with their users. But I feel like the way that you guys did it was a very different scale. You guys did it with people who don't always understand architecture, don't understand development. And I think that's very unique. And I'm gonna go back a little bit to when you were talking about when you were in college, how you felt like you were jumping a little bit through worlds. You went from your family, helping them with mechanics, and then jumped all the way to like school and understanding theory, and then had to be in an office environment. And in a way, you used that similar experience in this project because you had to really communicate architecture and development to people who don't understand architecture and development, to people who are going to be affected by something that they don't understand, but also jump back into the office environment and figure out how they're going to do this. That is a hard project to take on. So yeah, I think it's very impressive and very impactful, especially for the people who are going to be able to grow up with this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth talking about like the work that we did in Orlando wasn't like a charity case, like there was this notion when we started working with foundations and things like that. It's like, oh, you guys are gonna help the neighborhood, and like it's something that always it didn't bother us, right? It's not that serious, but Rub was kind of the wrong way in the sense that we weren't building the building to be like anybody's savior, like we really saw the merge of a need, like a particular spirit and people that live in the neighborhood, and something that we had skills to do that could facilitate, bring to life some of the vision that they were kind of already describing, and use our expertise to like help to refine the vision and to like bring it to life and things like that. But I think this idea of like in real estate, they call it highest and best use when they refer to like, is that building being used for its highest potential? And what they mean by that is, are you extracting the most amount of money from every square footage of that building? So if you could, in a 3-story building, and charge rent for 3 units, when would you only build one? That's like underutilized building, right? Quote unquote. And we like to challenge this notion because, I mean, Starling is an example of that. We could have built like a 3-story building by zoning rights, but it's not something that we could have done in 4.5 months. It's something that would have taken at least 2 more years to fundraise. It would have taken at least 1.5 years more to build. It would add a level of complexity that didn't go with the concept of the project, this idea of liberation and this idea of like responding to like making something happen faster and like being present and all those things. So the way that people have used Starling is highly utilized. It's like the best use, I would say, that corner lot could have. And so it's something that we always like to think about is like, again, to go back to my original question of like, if somebody points at an empty lot and says like, what should be built there? It's a huge question. And so like that is the project. And like the interesting thing about the author, whether that's a development team, an architecture team, or whoever, right? The responsibility is that you have to imagine something that's good for everybody, not just for you. And then you have to imagine something that ideally is like, has some kind of novelty to be better for that place. So it doesn't have to be like the nice iPhone and change the world in the way that people communicate, but something new for that particular location. And just because the project's small doesn't mean you can't investigate. Like profit sharing topic is huge. We hope that in the future, once it's established, that people can look at other buildings and say like, why don't you share your profit? This little tiny building is sharing our profit. There's a story about downtown Detroit that's owned by 3 families. Because there's a larger conversation about crowdfunding and like having answers to investments, right? Investment opportunities that they hadn't in the past of real estate, which that is one truth that is true, but we also should be talking about wealth redistribution. People have too much wealth, should be distributed. Just like Starling has extra money at the end of the year, it should be distributed in some way. In downtown Detroit, the push was for, I think, 1 to 3% to be open to investment to everyday people in like small increments. And imagine like there would be millions that neighbors could make. But then imagine if those 3 families redistributed 50% of the profit that downtown Detroit makes with no strings attached, no pay to play, just gives you a check because you live there and because like downtown is booming. That would be way more powerful. But somehow we're like afraid to have this wealth redistribution conversation. Not everybody. I mean, again, like there's a lot of really strong policymakers and advocacy groups that are talking about that, but that's the interesting thing. It's like that conversation is happening in that circle, but then in architecture, we're not talking about that yet. But then eventually when we are, surely it's going to get theorized and like intellectualized and made into 1,000 architecture books. But we need to start seeing these things in like even smaller scales, just responding for what they are. To rant about one other thing that bothers me about practice in general, again, not just architecture practice, is like this idea of like, how are you going to solve all the problems in the entire country? So like you build a good housing project, it's like, okay, but how does your project scale to solve the housing crisis of the US? It's like, it doesn't. It provides 5 families a stable, dignified place to live. Like that's a huge thing. That's good. He sets a precedent for other people to kind of follow that level of quality. That's a huge thing. So I think like we fall under this like wannabe tech bro thing where like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make a building that will change the world. It's like relax, just make really good work, make it very meaningful to the people that are in that space and in that neighborhood. And I think those presidents so like we'll build on each other and people will start to build better buildings over time.
I know it's like a smaller scale building, but I think it does open conversations to what architecture could be like. And I think that goes back to like the values of Duo and being an innovation firm, one that looks towards the future and continues to just change the way things are created, designed, and even decided. Coming to the time to wrap this episode up, so we have a few more questions. So, is there any advice you could share with designers who are interested in innovation or even in the different side of architecture in their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say for like younger designers, maybe people in school, it's not necessarily advice, but a perspective that I think has helped me is to try to look beyond the walls of the architecture school and not just going to see what the graphic designers are doing and what the product designers are doing, but really like try to learn from other worlds that you just like actually feel like you have no understanding of, like whether that's business stuff. You hear this a lot in like artists or design or architecture people. Like I'm just not good at business. And I said, okay, well then learn, immerse yourself. Same with like community engagement or research or anthropology or sociology. Like, don't just read the architecture books and go to the architecture classes. There's events happening in the city, especially we're in our village of West in Chicago, where we have so many institutions. But like go to the philosophy lectures and go to the poetry nights and go to the music jams and listen to community member meetings. And there are so many things that you can do if you're trying to like educate yourself for your professional life that will also just like enrich your personal life. I think that a lot of us study design because that's the way that we see the world and like to participate in it. And so I think that has given me a lot of respect in terms of like, don't insulate yourself and only see buildings and intellectualize buildings and hang out at the text and read architecture books and learn more, do more, hang out with other people. Also to like rethink what practice is. Something that I struggle with is like this issue of identity, which again, when we talked about my innovation story, it's something natural. Like we all struggle at times, or like we all go through that process of like, who am I? Like, what am I? How do I describe myself? And somebody says, introduce yourself. Right? So something that I think my brother and sister had been really instrumental for me in particular is like just helping to expand the definition is like not don't worry so much if people don't say like, oh, you're an architect, you're doing so many things. Like you are doing architecture and you are doing development and you are doing real estate and you are doing art, but you don't need to be sort of like titled a one singular thing. And I don't know at what point in the architecture school or practice it happens, but I think a lot of the field of architecture makes people feel like if you're not an architect with a license, then like you just weren't cut for it, like sorry, you're just not one of the good ones, So I think getting over that as fast as you can is like essential, not just for your own mental health, but like also it will like really fuel your personal professional work. And I think any kind of like perspective for established practitioners is to really think about the relationship to their clients and like what it is that they're doing. I understand like when running a business, it's really hard, especially when you have big staff and things like that. And especially if you have a business that has been running a certain way for a long time, changing that is very difficult. But I think you can have increments to think about, can I participate in a different way in this particular project? Can I ask my client if I can also be an investor with part of our architecture fee? Or can I ask my client if we can also take a little more time so that we can do more community engagement, learn to explain kind of like what that means and how that would help the project? Or, like, yes, refine the scope, but also like try to get more of an understanding of like what those more traditional clients are doing. That's one half. And like, yeah, I would say like try to do your own projects in the sense that like you have all the hardest skills for built environment practice probably live somewhere in or within reaching distance of an architecture firm, like fabrication, design, and permitting. Like architecture firms usually are able to get through those barriers. And so really thinking about like, are there any projects that the office can do independently? It's not just research, right? Like that's not just research for an exhibition or for the feature book that we're going to publish. But even if it's a small scale, like what's something that the firm can like self-initiate and launch and like do this as a project without client and try to like put our money where our mouth is in terms of our practice and our values and things like that. Most studios would be able to do something, even if it's not something that has kind of like public benefit too, right? Like even if it's not a giant building that you're building or like you're not gonna build a museum by yourself, right? But you can do so many things that share your practice, that share your methods, that other people again that can learn from, where we're setting new precedents that we all can learn from and build off of each other and collaborate more. Something I like about Chicago is that it's a very collaborative environment when it comes to like designers, architects, artists. Other cities are like really competitive, but here it feels like we go to each other's talks and go like see each other and hang out. You know, like I really like that about Chicago. So similarly to that kind of social aspects, we are learning from each other's projects. And so like I think it does matter for practices themselves to like put their perspective out there. And it's a little scary at first, but even without, say like, well, I did that because my client said, it's like, this is why, and this is what it is, and that's it. We're inspired by musicians a lot in that way. New music, go to your basement, make an album and drop it and see if people like it. Like, I think it's really cool. So that would be some of us.
I think that's very good advice. I feel like it's very important to really understand other people's perspectives and really put yourself out there and explore. There's so much in this world, especially in Chicago. So I think that that's really good advice. And do you have any future plans or goals for yourself, for Duo?
Yes, I will give a sneak peek of a work that we are actively doing. It's called Obras Compartidas, Spanish, shared works, English. And essentially the notion builds from those real estate development classes that we started giving in 2017. So earlier this year in May, we gave a super weekend, in quotes, real estate development class, and about 60 people attended. So from those people, basically the reality we are imagining is an everyday person should be able to build a building if they want to. Like they should be able to develop a building that they want to, obviously through the right processes and methods and things like that. And so we tabbed that class for people that were interested in development, and then we identified people who wanted to actually build a building, develop a building, and we're partnering with them to do that. Like we're actually business partnering with them. And right now there are 12 people that we're working with. So in the next year or so, we should be seeing, like those 12 different projects that actually get designed and get ready for construction. And there will be some that will start to actually get built. It's really exciting because a lot of the projects are in the southwest sides. Somehow most of them, I think, landed in the west side neighborhoods of Chicago, but they're all neighborhood scale. So kind of like think of Starlink size. I personally love being in neighborhoods. I don't really like being around towers. So we try to focus our work in kind of like that particular neighborhood scale. And led by everyday people who live in some of these places or have ideas about some of these places. And obviously some people were born. But I think that's going to set a really cool precedent for how people become developers, because today, really the way to become a developer is circumstantial. Like you have two paths. You go get an MBA with a concentration in real estate, you go work for a big real estate company, or you get lucky. Like I got lucky and you find a mentor, or you get lucky and you had a family member who leaves you a bunch of buildings, and then all of a sudden you have a portfolio of buildings to manage and sell or build or whatever. So in this way, we're partnering with people in the first development so that they overcome the barriers of that first one. From like the biggest barriers that we've learned about are access to know-how is the biggest one. Even if you have money, but you don't know how to do it, you're not going to do it. So access to know-how, access to a network of professionals, architects, lawyers, accountants, everybody, and then access to funding. So because we're partners, it's not like a mentorship work. We're partners with people. We are actively kind of like going through the design process and like all the multi-contextual design process with them and fund number projects and things like that. So that's a sneak peek. We're going to announce more details later, but you're going to start to see a lot of these buildings happen.
Well, I'm excited to see the work you guys do. I'm really happy that we were able to have this conversation. I feel like it was a really different perspective than what I'm used to. And I feel like we get a lot of perspectives on this podcast, but it was different because I felt like I was talking to architect, a human-centered designer, and then also a consultant and a developer and at the same time. So I think that this was a really cool conversation. And I'm very excited to see what Duo continues to do.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This was really pleasant.
Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I want to thank everyone for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_design pod or find us at beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the Beyond the Surface team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface, featuring Rafael Robles. Until next time, goodbye.